He and two of the city guards had thrown the last tax collector in an undercell. "No, please! I'll pay back what I owe tenfold! Please don't leave me in one of these! Please!" the well-dressed thief shouted. Lord Commander Fari had heard prisoners scream for nearly 20 years since she joined as a young guard trainee. Each one had a story as sad as the last, and everyone insisted they committed no crime. He had heard and seen it all. This was the first time in his life that he had been in the Underdungeon, though. It was a horrid place deep under the dungeon. No light came in. There were no beds, and worst of all, you were alone. No light came in. There were no beds, and worst of all, you were alone. The Underdungeon had been used in decades past for rapists, traitors, and murderers. Its prisoners would go mad from the complete darkness and isolation. Fari mused that death might have been kinder. The muddy ground sucked at his boots, and something was dripping on him as he made his way back up to the first dungeon. A drip would occasionally hit his torch, making it hiss and go dim for a moment. The damp, cold air gave him bumps up his arms and a chill down his back. The stone walls were covered in a slick green slime of some sort, so there was no hope of using it to steady yourself. Fari wondered if he would even be able to get out. No sooner than he had wiped the last of the mud off of his boots, he received a summons from Prince Geoffrey. He was sitting at his father's desk, writing letters and signing decrees. Nothing kingdom-changing, just requests for building, extra watch on a particular wall, and other small matters. William the Wizard was there with him, giving advice as well as he could. Fari always thought the wizard was a tad goofy, the way he stammered and wore that oversized blue robe. "You sent for me, your highness?" "Lord Commander Fari, thank you for coming. I hate to bother you, but do you believe you would be able to spare some men to investigate why revenue has been down?" "Yes, of course, though I'm afraid not all of them have the talent of reading or writing." The embarrassment was clear on the prince's face. "Yes, of course. Just gather the ones who do have the talent and have them write down what they tend to hear, and we will sort it out." "Yes, your highness." Fari stood there. The prince gave him a queer look before he realized. "Oh, I apologize. You are dismissed, Lord Commander. Thank you for your time." "Thank you, your highness." He turned and walked out the door, but crept his head back in. "You are doing fantastically, if you don't mind me saying." The prince smiled at that. What he must be going through. Running a kingdom must have been hard, and having to meet his father's expectations must have made him feel like the castle itself was thrown on his back. Fari himself had never known his own father, which he figured was good and bad. Other children had no fathers as well, but theirs had died in battle, or a farming accident, or had been killed by bandits. His father drank himself to death. In his hometown of Wildern there wasn't much work for a widow, so him and his mother needed to move in with their blind grandfather. The old man couldn't work himself, but he owned a home and some land. Deer would always come and eat the few crops they were able to plant, so to keep from going hungry, young Fari took his grandfather's bow and began to practice. From dawn to twilight he would shoot his grandfather's 3 arrows over and over, and he would stay up late to watch for deer. He missed the first 9 deer, but the 10th arrow found its target. They wasted a lot of meat the first time, since they had never dressed a deer before, but they learned quickly. They had to. Fari would hunt, and his mother would roast. The smell of venison cooking gave him something to look forward to each night. As he got older, his skill improved, and he never wasted a shot. Before long, his family had found that they had more meat than they could eat, so they would trade cuts of meat for corn, peas, potatoes, arrows, and they even managed to barter for a chicken. He eventually became well-liked in Wildern, and once an old woman told him of the competitions at Warren's place. He had saved up some money, so he decided he would go compete, just for fun. He left the arena with a woven crown, and the prize money of 100 gold, and countless letters from different factions asking him to join them. The Wyverns, the Griffins, the City Guard, the Standing Army, they all wanted him to join them. He didn't think much of any of them. He had a living and enough gold to live out the rest of his days comfortably, if he was frugal. One night, as he came home from hunting, he noticed that he couldn't smell any venison cooking. When he entered his grandfather's house, he saw his mother and grandfather, both dead. Their throats slit, and his mother stripped naked. Bandits had taken everything that looked valuable, along with 100 gold and the lives of his only living family. Shortly after, he sent a letter to the city guard, accepting their offer. The city guard were the watchers and protectors of the realm. Where the standing army fought foreign invaders or marched into foreign land to fight the king's battles, the city guard fought homegrown threats, like bandits. They were always active, in peace and in war. Day and night they watched and guarded. Though their name implied they guarded only the city of Linwood, they in truth patrolled the entire kingdom, from the endless mountains to the border of the land of ice and fire, from the Lynn River all the way to the wide sea, men on their horses, watching, guarding. In truth, he did very poorly in training, and was worthless with a sword, though it mattered little in reality, since the bow had functionally replaced the sword in the Middle Kingdom a century prior. Nevertheless, learning sword was a necessary part of training, but his skill with a bow alone made Lord Commander Urin give him his mark and helm. The mark was worn on the hip. On it was the crest of the city guard, a shield over a castle. The helm had 2 sharp protrusions on top. Some said they were the strong horns of the Wyvern, meant to instill fear in the hearts of evildoers. Others said they were the Griffin's ears, a constant reminder to stay vigilant. Whatever it was supposed to be, Fari cared little for it. It was extremely uncomfortable to him. Lord Commander Urin had been commander of the city guard for 58 years, and before his death he wrote a letter to King Joel recommending Fari as the new Lord Commander. He wasn't sure why, but when he looked at his comrades, he understood a little. Knights were the noble leaders of the standing army, and well-trained men-at-arms served under them. But the city guard was full of low-born rabble that could barely swing a sword, and would hit a target an eighth of the time. At least Fari knew how to use his bow properly. He had learned how to read on his days off, and Urin himself was illiterate, so Fari had always read all the letters and had already taken over the paperwork long before Lord Commander Urin fell ill. That might have played a role as well. That was 20 years ago, and in the time between, he had been a loyal and trusted servant to the crown, and now the crown had trusted him with a job. Fari went to the 4 of his guards out of the 500 in the city he knew could read and write, and gave them the task. They weren't the most competent or honorable, but they were not the bottom of the barrel by any means, and they could use a pen. He wasn't adept at penmanship himself, maybe because it was just a really short sword, but he knew enough to get by. He walked the cobblestone streets he had patrolled all these years. The houses and shops were all similar, with tan or yellow walls and red roofs, and tightly placed together. In other cities and towns, there were alleys between houses, but not in Linwood. It meant more buildings for housing and businesses, but also no small corridors for running criminals to hide in. The streets were half a furlong across, wide enough to leave the ancient ash trees that towered over the city unmolested. Some of the ancient ash that spread their arms as far as a furlong and a half from the trunk were large enough to have buildings on top of them. One such was the Imperial Library, woven through the ancient ash, spiraling up and out. And some nobility used similar structures for houses also. When St. Lin settled Linwood thousands of years ago, he had left the largest and strongest trees uncut, and said that all who lived there would be blessed by them. Fari wasn't sure whether he believed the tale, or whether anyone was actually blessed, since they seemed to get in the way quite a bit. But it was against the law to harm the trees nonetheless. He was en route to his first stop when he saw a boy, probably less than 12, scraping at an ancient ash with a rock. "Halt!" he yelled, bow drawn. The boy also had a small sack, and Fari saw a shopkeep running out of his shop, shouting, "You, boy! Give me back that hat!" Hats could be quite pricey, especially if made properly. Fari had spent 5 gold on his own hat, that wide-brimmed thing that cast a shadow over his whole body, and the blue feather in the brim. He chose to wear that instead of the pointed helm soon after he became Lord Commander, and he loved it dearly. The boy began to run, and Fari shouted again, "Halt! In the name of the king!" Running from a crime was itself a serious crime. Mercy would be shown to those who surrendered, but the city guard was instructed to end anyone who ran. Running from a man of the city guard was suicide. Fari lined up his bow between the boy's ribs, aiming right for the heart. Then he heard the scream, "No, Thomas, stop running! Thomas, no!" A woman was screaming at the boy, presumably his mother. In that moment, Fari remembered his own mother, how she cared for him in his youth, the smell of venison cooking every night, her bloody hands as she tried to skin a deer for the first time, her corpse naked in a pool of blood on the floor of his grandfather's house. Fari loosed his arrow. It flew through the air with a hum, and it had found its target, precisely where Fari had aimed. The boy dropped the bag, and his mother shrieked. The boy stopped and turned around. The arrow had flown straight through the bag, the broadhead arrow slicing through the cloth, cutting it where he was grabbing. The bag fell to the ground, revealing a purple hat with a white feather. The boy was unharmed. After returning the hat to the hatter and the boy to his mother, Fari began to ask around about trade. Some thought they were being questioned or accused of theft, but most were helpful. He found himself writing the same thing over and over. War in the East. Welcome to the Storytime Saturday podcast. My name is TGD, and I'm your host this week. And I'll be your host every week, continually. So in this chapter, we follow the Lord Commander of the City Guard, named Fari, as he goes out to investigate the lack of coin and why trade has been down. He's been given this task by the prince, Geoffrey, who is now the acting king in his father's absence. Now, we'll go through the writing section like usual. I actually have a lot to say this week about the actual writing aspect of this chapter. So, in the beginning, when he's in the Underdungeon, I mentioned about the walls. There was no hope of using it to steady yourself. I'm not sure the use of yourself is proper here. Like, speaking directly to the audience. Like, if you were there, you couldn't use it to steady yourself. Like that. I'm not sure that's the proper thing to do there. I sort of want to do that. I'll catch myself when I'm writing nowadays doing that because I want the reader to relate to what's going on, or I guess to put themselves in, because it sounds more relatable than saying there was no hope of using it to steady oneself, you know? That doesn't sound as good to me, but it's probably, like, more proper to say it that way. Much of this chapter, as a matter of fact, probably 3/4 of this chapter is exposition. It might be 2/3, but it's a major section of this chapter is just exposition, talking about Fari's origin story. Now, the skillful way to learn about a character's origins, or as a writer to do a character's origins, is to drop nuggets here and there throughout the story that will tell you what their backstory was and how it's affecting them today. That's the skillful way of doing that. To show what happened to him in the past affects who he is now. But when I gave people this chapter to read, I let them read this Fari chapter, and they said they liked it. They said they liked the origin story. They said that this was an interesting character, that they knew a lot about him because of this origin story. And in truth, Fari is a side character. Even though he's a point of view character, he's a side character. He's a side point of view character. which might be why I decided to give him his entire origin story right up front instead of letting it sort of drip out throughout the story. Because Fari is kind of just straightforward. We'll talk more about Fari later on, though. But as far as this expositional origin story, I'm not sure that I like it. I'm not sure I want to do this again, to write like this anymore. As a matter of fact, the book that I'm working on right now has an origin story just like this. An origin story just like this that's mostly expositional. And it's also for a side character, a relatively unimportant character. And I'm considering just removing it. I'm considering removing it completely. And doing something else. So, yeah, I'm not sure I would want to do that again. Now, something I want to point out, I know that I'll probably be called a misogynist and an ageist for simply using his mother and grandfather as plot devices. I just introduce them so they can die, so Fari has motivation. So I'm objectifying women by making them a plot device and objectifying old people. I know no one cares about old people though. But I mentioned before that I write in such a way as to avoid criticism. There's things that I don't want to do. I stifle myself creatively because I know that Anita Sarkeesian complained about this. Like, I don't care what Anita Sarkeesian thinks, in truth. I actually don't. But if I don't have to deal with that criticism, I would rather not. So in a way, I'm kind of letting critics win. I'm letting these culture, hawks, I guess, culture hawks, these people who are critical of the culture, I'm letting them win. By just saying, I don't want to deal with their complaining, so I won't do it. So it's actually as I was reading this, writing down notes, that was actually pretty emotionally impactful. Even though it's not written in a way that's like there's no poetry or anything, there's nothing like that. Just the fact that that's there, the fact that his entire family was killed by bandits, like did resonate with me emotionally. And that fear of criticism is keeping me from doing things that are emotionally impactful, I find. So I'm kind of learning stuff about, looking at myself from 4 years ago as compared to now, that there's certain things that I don't want to do now, and maybe I should. Maybe I shouldn't stifle myself creatively. Also, in the origin story, just as a note, I should probably put this in the notes section, but I mentioned that his grandfather had 3 arrows. Fari's grandfather had 3 arrows. There's no symbolism there. There's at that time when I wrote this, I literally had 3 arrows. That was all I had. So I'm like, well, I have 3 arrows, so then I'll just have him have 3 arrows. No reference to German democratic socialism intended at all. No hidden meaning there. So let's talk about Fari himself. Fari is this guy. He's based on this guy. And for those that might be just listening and can't see what I'm showing right now, this character I simply stole from the infamous CDI Zelda games. Who this guy, apparently his name is not Fari. This guy's name is Lord Cairo or Lord Kiro. But his fan name is Fari. The fans dubbed him Fari. I'm pretty sure he's a pretty major character in the Zelda CDI, but he's definitely an important character in the Zelda CDI YouTube poops. Fari. Fari is. And I actually found out, as I was researching, taking notes for this podcast, that Fari, the name, comes from a YouTube poop where someone simply inverted Guanum, the guy on the magic carpet. They simply reversed him saying, "We're off." Fari. So that's where his name comes from. They just reversed "We're off," and that's where Fari came from. In the games, as far as I know, he doesn't have any character really. He arrests Duke Onklet, and I think that's it. He arrests Duke Onklet, and there's not much else to say about him. So he doesn't have really any character to speak of. Really, the only thing I took from the CDI game was the design. Like, I literally describe him looking just like this. He has a wide brimmed hat with a feather in it. I even like sort of copy the voice when I was reading this. But yeah, I guess the character is fairly original, like the actual characterization of him, for as little as there is in this section. And we don't see a whole lot of his characterization. We learn his backstory, but not a whole lot about him. We don't see him interact with a ton of people too much. The things we do know about him, we learn that he's an orphan, so he's all alone. He doesn't have any living family. So maybe that's why he's being tender and kind to the prince, because he has no one else to be tender and kind to. We mentioned that he's terrible with a sword, which I'm fairly confident that in Fari's other chapters that doesn't show up at all. Him being incompetent with a sword doesn't show up at all. Now, in my current writing, if I were to mention someone's not good at something, I would feel the need to make that like a central plot point, a Chekhov's gun that comes up later, that it's foreshadowing, oh, well, he's bad at this, so then later he'll be put in that situation and he won't be able to do anything. And that's how he's defeated. I gotta mention that I feel like in a lot of ways, the Chekhov's gun, like the foreshadowing, has been used so much at this point that the audience sort of just knows that it's coming. They'll see that and they'll say, oh, that means later on he's going to get into a sword fight, he's going to lose his bow, and he's going to get in a sword fight, and he's going to lose, and that's how he's going to die. That doesn't happen. So I guess it's kind of subversive to not have that matter. I guess in a way. Although someone would say, it's almost like the, who said it? Who was it? Todd Howard? From Bethesda that said it's a glitch and it's a feature. Something like that. So it's when you do something that's bad and say, oh, I did that on purpose. You don't understand how smart I am. I'm an artist. Yeah, good guy Fari. Good guy Fari doesn't shoot the kid, even though like it's his duty to. In the Middle Kingdom, running from the city guard gives them license to shoot to kill. So that like cues you into how serious they take crime in the Middle Kingdom. But yeah, Fari, even though he has the full right to just shoot that kid in the middle of the street, he doesn't do it. And he uses his immense skill with a bow to end the situation peacefully. So the chapter ends with the Shopkeeps when Fari goes to investigate and ask them what's going on with all the trade. They mention war in the East as the cause for trade being down. So now we're what is this, eight chapters in, and the threads are touching each other. The plot threads are touching, and they're about to start winding together into one cohesive narrative. Kinda. Now, what would have been good is to actually see this happening. This is Fari's entire reason for going out into the city, and he gets half of a paragraph. 3 sentences of his investigation. The much better thing to do would be to actually show him investigating. But I had probably, let me do this real quick. I want to see what the word count of this chapter is. 2,000. I did this. I don't know if I mentioned this already, but I did this for NaNoWriMo. I did all of this in the month of November in 2017. This was all in November of 2017. And my goal was, I think in order to hit the 50,000 words in 31 days, you had to hit a 1,600 word a day benchmark. So if you wrote 1,600 words a day, you would hit 50,000 by the end of November. So that's why each of these chapters are kind of short and they don't end really well. I really need to learn how to end chapters well anyway, because that's not something I'm good at to begin with. But this does seem abruptly ended, and that's not, it's not good. This was for NaNoWriMo, so that's why this is only 2,000 words. Like, that's not a chapter. The chapters I write now are 6,000 words. The chapters I write in my books now are anywhere between 4,500 and 6,000 words. So these are very short chapters comparatively. Even for a regular book, I don't think there's any regular book you would find that has chapters this short. Some other notes are that we see the cultural phenomenon that is the tournaments at Warren's place. And this could make or break someone. We've seen that Gade was discovered at the tournaments. We know that Lord Commander Fari was discovered at the tournaments. So this is an important thing culturally, that this is where the stars come from. This can make your entire career if you have the skill. But we'll talk more about the tournament when it shows up, because there is an entire tournament arc to go through, and we'll have plenty to talk about then. So, Fari is the Lord Commander of the City Guard, and the City Guard and the Standing Army are two separate factions, like the police and the military, or the FBI and the CIA. They're two separate entities, or the Navy and the Coast Guard. Though they might have like similar functions, they're separate entities with separate jobs. And in a lot of medieval fantasy, and this is probably because this is the way it was in the Middle Ages, the guards and the army are the same thing. The city guards and the army are the same people. So I figured I'd be different. I'd have different factions, and who doesn't love factions, right? I myself love factions. I love all different kinds of factions. So we're playing Oblivion on the channel right now, and the City Guard, I guess, is kind of like the Imperial Legion, that in Oblivion the Imperial Legion rides up and down the road, attack, looking for bandits and stuff. But as Fari mentions, the City Guard is not the cream of the crop. They are not an elite faction. Now, it mentions that the Ashwood trees... I wanted something to be kind of symbolic of the kingdom, that they would have something important. I know in Game of Thrones, the Starks, the people of the North, they hold the weirwood trees in... they revere the weirwood trees. So I'm like, well, they need some sort of like holy wood, right? Like, that's what people like. They like wood. I don't know. So I needed some sort of symbolism, and I just decided it would be ash. I mentioned in the first chapter that the king of the Middle Kingdom sits on the Ashwood throne. So, not really a whole lot there. I might have looked it up, ash and its symbolism. I'm like, oh, maybe that's cool. But I couldn't tell you any of it if you paid me right now. I don't know anything about it. I forgot it all. Also, when he's in the city, he mentions that the streets are half a furlong wide. I looked up medieval measurements because in my mind, I thought that if I insert something normal people wouldn't know anything about, that means my writing would be good. So I throw in the word furlong and they go, ooh, furlong. And they're like, oh, what's a furlong? What's a furlong? And because I know what a furlong is, that means I am very smart. instead of just using something that the audience would already know. So, but anyway, a furlong is 220 yards or 660 feet or an eighth of a mile. So you don't have to look it up if you didn't already know. So Linwood, which is the capital, it's not mentioned, but Linwood is the capital of the Middle Kingdom. It's where the king lives, and it's like the central hub of the kingdom. So Linwood has tree houses in these ancient ashwood trees, and there's a tree library. I forgot entirely about that fact, and I'm pretty sure I forgot about it immediately after I wrote this chapter, because I don't think it ever comes up again. Having a treetop library is kind of cool, and it's completely irrelevant. It might be mentioned, maybe Gerald will mention the library, but that's it. Doesn't show up ever again. So it's kind of just a fun factoid, I guess, world building. I have a problem with that. I have a problem doing world building that's not relevant to the story. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't have a problem with that, but I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, well, there's a library here, and there's this tower here, and there's a castle over there, if we're never going to go there. Like, it's not relevant, you know? Now, last, I want to mention the Wyvern and Griffin iconography. I literally just wanted a classic coat of arms look, you know, with the shield in the middle and the lion on the one side going like this, and there's a unicorn like this on the other side. And I'm like, okay, like a dragon and a griffin, like a wyvern and a griffin. And it was just intuitive, it made sense. And I don't think there's an existing coat of arms that has a wyvern and griffin as the animals on the side. So I don't think it exists, and it was very intuitive. Like, it just made sense to do it. So I kind of wove that iconography through the story to give it significance culturally, but it kind of just ends up being confusing because there's factions in Warren's place called the Wyvern and the Griffin. There's the Wyvern and the Griffin are symbolized in the city guard on their helms. It's like no one has any clue what's going on, and I myself really honestly have no clue what's going on. So the Wyvern and Griffin will continue to show up through the story throughout the Middle Kingdom. And now I will leave you with this as we end. Verse of the Castle Defense by Gyro, a bard. The men from the south came from trees tall and green, spears in their hands and wolf furs on their sleeve. The men of Luxvale raised up their gate, that day they decided that they would be brave. The wolves came in running with sharp claws and teeth. The men of Luxvale made the great battle brief. They cut down their foes so they no longer lingered. Joshua Purrington lost his long finger. We'll be going to see Josh's point of view next week. So come back next week. I hope you liked the video, and subscribe to the channel. Check out the YouTube channel. We got lots of stuff on here going on. The YouTube channel is lit, to tell you the truth. We're doing lots of stuff, and it's awesome. So check out the channel. Come back next week for Storytime Saturday to see what's going on with Joshua after he lost his finger. His middle finger was cut off. So we'll see how he's doing next week. I appreciate you specifically. Thank you for being here this week. Thank you for being part of the Storytime Saturday podcast, and I'll see you next week.